Welcome back to our listeners and our readers to another installment here of What's New with Inspicio Arts and the FIU Ratcliffe Art and Design Incubator. Just for everyone who's watching us, this is part of Florida International University here in Miami, Florida. We are housed under the College of Communication, Architecture, and the Arts. So I want to welcome back in again Professor Raymond, we call him Ray Ellman. Welcome back to this collaboration.
I should have added that only my mother called me Raymond.
Like that show, right? Everybody loves Raymond.
Yes, I never watched that show, by the way. I don't know why. It must have been psychological. Anyway, thank you for having me back again, Maggie. It's always such a treat to talk with you.
I've heard that. Thank you so much. Likewise.
We're going to be talking about one of our next interviews that we're going to publish, and it's with the eclectic architect of ideas, Richard Saul Wurman.
Yeah, and I'd like to kick it off because I had a chance to review some of the interview. And I was quite taken by it because as someone who has been a fan of one of the things that he's known for, which is the TED conference, I learned a lot from it. And, as someone who loves content and worked in content for, over a decade, I always thought that the TED conference had some type of sequence. And I learned listening to this interview that I was exactly right in what his strategy was, that one talk ended and then the other one started and they kind of flow together. So talk to me a little bit about what you learned about his idea. Where did this, kind of phenomenon of the TED conference come from? Because that's really what it is.
Well, I think it grew out of his thinking and interests in general. Richard is very eclectic in what he gets interested in. So for example, he has a bachelor's and master's degree in architecture from the University of Pennsylvania, which is one of the top architecture schools in the country. And he studied with Kahn, who was a very famous architect, and then went to work for him. But at some point just stopped practicing architecture because he was interested in so many other things. And so TED stands for technology, entertainment, and design. And he started TED in California, where there's more of a confluence of that, perhaps, especially the entertainment part, than any other place in the country. And what's interesting about the beginnings of it, he says that he didn't have any money of his own at that point. And he put in $10,000 for the first TED conference, got some other people to invest $10,000. And they did the first one and lost money on it. So he didn't do another one until 6 years later. And at some point, through word of mouth, really, not through promotion or marketing or advertising, the TED conference caught hold with, I think, word of mouth of the kind of people that he invited to participate. So he was very careful that, as you were saying, that the people complemented each other, even though they might be in totally different disciplines. And in his TED conference, which we should distinguish from TED Talks, I think TED Talks is what happened after they people bought the TED conference concept from him and they turned it into TED Talks. But TED conference, Richard actually sat on stage through the whole thing and sort of was the impresario and introduced people and made sure that they followed the rules of the TED conference. He had a way of getting people to be at their best in addressing these audiences. And he emphasizes things like there was no reserved seating. Even the presenters didn't have a seat reserved for them in the audience. It was first come, first serve, and things like that. So he came up with a concept that really hadn't existed before, and it really caught people's imaginations.
So I want to also touch upon the fact that, he sort of was a visionary because, those talks, the conference, dealt with the intersection of technology and of all these other conversations. So I think he was sort of a visionary for his time when the TED conference launched. Is that accurate to say?
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. And I think he describes his lifelong process. One of the things he said to me, I was exactly like this when I was a teenager. So he said it didn't quite work being a teenager and being like the kind of person I am right now, but he was that way. He was curious. He didn't care what other people wanted to teach him as much as what interested him. And he also calls himself a cartographer, even though he never taught a class in map making or cartography, because he's approached the organization of information almost like he was trying to map it like a photographer, but doing it in unusual ways. And you can see he's written and published over 100 books. I have an example of one.
Yeah, let's see that. One of them. That's incredible. Yeah, understanding.
But it's called Understanding. And even when you look at the table of contents.
Yes, it's very nicely organized and laid out graphically and visually.
Yes, and I'm doing a bad job of, oh, here it is. So you can see this is the table of contents, and it looks almost more like a magazine than a book in some ways. Very graphic, and he admires graphic design. He gave a talk about understanding at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And then he learned years later that they wanted to build a facility to study that concept. And they put his name on it, even though he didn't donate money to make that happen. They call it the Richard Saul Wurman Center for Understanding. So he comes up with titles like that, like Understanding, or the Music of Conversation, that make you immediately leap to a different way of thinking about whatever the topic is.
So let's kind of shift gears, because there's a timely event that's going on that's tied to something that he took up during the pandemic, which is watercolors. And now he has an exhibit. He seems like, I don't know, like a multi-talented, multifaceted, eclectic kind of moment of our time, right? In terms of persona. So how does that come up?
What's interesting is he's 86 years old, but he's bristling with energy. And so when you say moment of our time, I think that's kind of eternal for him. He's always adjusting to the times. And he had done some watercolors and some painting, being trained as an architect in the days when you used a pencil to draft elevations and images of buildings and stuff. He had some talent in that area, but he's never exhibited his artwork before. He hasn't created much artwork, and during the pandemic, he had nothing to do, so he started doing watercolors of birds that are very unusual, and he got a whole bunch of frames from Michael's, the kind of art supply place. He got a whole bunch of frames from them, and he ran out of frames. So he said, and he couldn't get them from Michael's. They ran out of frames. And he said, well, I'll try making sculpture. So he'd never made sculpture before. He got some plasticine and then had the results cast in bronze. And all of that is being exhibited at the Coral Gables Museum in Coral Gables. And I went to the
I believe that runs through November 8th for whoever's interested in going there to see it. We'll post that on social media that it started back in August and runs through November the 8th at the Coral Gables Museum.
And I went to the opening, and it was remarkable because he has a lot of talent. And I said to him during our interview, do you have any plans for continuing to exhibit your work? He said, no. I mean, he's not trying to make a career out of it. And yet his sculpture was really interesting and actually reminded me of the sculpture of a very good friend of mine who's been at it her whole life. One of the other interesting things he did there was he got a chair manufacturer to donate a certain style of chair that is sprinkled throughout the exhibition space. So you can sit in front of a sculpture and sort of contemplate it. And there's probably, I don't know, 20 chairs that are scattered about what's normally a big open space in a museum when they have an exhibit. So he's always thinking of new ways of doing things and new ways of making you think.
So what can we expect moving forward? Who else do we have in the upcoming weeks, if we can share that?
Well, one person is Norman Mailer's sister. So Norman Mailer's won 2 Pulitzer prizes, and he, was one of the most famous writers of the 20th century. And his sister is a younger sister, I think by maybe 6 years or maybe less, but she's 94 years old. And I interviewed her, and she has just published her memoir, which is going to be, I did a joint interview for both Inspicio Arts and for the Miami Book Fair. And she wrote, she kind of had a journal where she kept track of experiences in her life and wrote them as stories over a 22-year period. And that turned into this book, which has 15 different stories. But it starts off with 1948, where she's just graduated from Ratcliffe College, which was Harvard's women's college at the time. And she goes over to visit Norman, who's with his first wife in Paris. And they discovered that his first novel, Naked and the Dead, has become the biggest sensation in publishing. And basically, he was set for life after that book came out. And so they're all kind of basking in that. And they meet some people in Paris who are Spanish, and they recruit her to help them get political prisoners in Franco's Spain out of jail and smuggle them into France. So that's the first story in the book, that she's just graduated from Radcliffe, and she and a classmate from Radcliffe drive from Paris to Spain with these 2 Spaniards and smuggle political prisoners back to France. So that's how the book starts. So she's had a lot of different kinds of.
Norman Mailer.
So her name's Barbara Mailer Wasserman is her last name, her married name. And her husband was Al Wasserman, was a Academy Award-winning documentarian, and then later a longtime segment producer for 60 Minutes.
Okay.
And her son, Peter Olson, is a good friend of mine, and I played tennis with him for years. And he's an author. He just had a novel come out last year, but he's a great memoirist. And I interviewed him for Inspicio Arts and for the Miami Book Fair last year. So we did the same kind of thing with his mother this year.